Given the amount of light left, I thought it was a good idea to charge the batteries. So, I flipped the lever for the solar cell array collector. It did a good job of charging the battery pack fast, and we wouldn't have to worry about a power shortage. About a year ago, the space station lost almost all of its power and had another 40 minutes till it lined up with the sun again. The majority of the battery cells had lost their ability to retain a charge and could only hold about 2% of their normal capacity. It wouldn't have enough power to make it another orbit around the Earth. We would lose power to life support before then. NASA ran diagnostics afterwards and narrowed it down to a powerful solar flare. It was a freak incident. The sun can give us life and can take it away. If it hadn't been for my cosmonaut cohort, we might not have survived the ordeal. It was a close call, and his quick thinking and brilliant engineering skills saved our hides. The underperforming battery cells have since been replaced, but I like to do my part and keep things optimally charged to avoid a similar situation from occurring. I returned the favor about 2 months later. We were doing a spacewalk, and the connector on Sergey's tether snapped, and he began floating out to space. He panicked, hyperventilated, and passed out. Luckily, I was nearby and was able to rescue him from an icy death in space. We had each other's backs, and I don't think there's anything that could come between our bond. Time for our daily chess match. We had a magnetic board that kept the pieces from floating off. I set the board up and waited for Sergey to arrive. He was late. I couldn't recall any pressing tasks that required his attention. When he finally showed up, he just floated in the doorway and stared at the chessboard. "Your move," I said. My comms light flashed. Sergey's eyes widened like a fortune teller had told him there would be a call at that moment. It wasn't time for my normal check-in, so what could the command center want? "Don't answer it." Beads of sweat dotted his forehead. He wiped them away with his arm. His hands gripped the frame of the doorway tight enough that his knuckles turned white. "You know I have to. It could be something important." I picked up the receiver and listened. The message was pre-recorded and looped over and over. I couldn't believe what I heard. Full-out nuclear attack, retaliatory strike, millions of casualties, and the last bit chilled me to the bone. Take out the enemy and secure the space station. I set the receiver down. The wrench in Sergey's hand rattled from nervousness. I held up my hand in a take it easy kind of way. I sat back down to the chessboard, looked up, and smiled at him. Sergey let out a huge sigh, relaxed his grip, and lowered his hands. The wrench floated away. He sailed over to the chessboard and sat across from me like he had done hundreds of times before. Sergey smiled and made his first move of the game. More than likely, we wouldn't be a high priority to either of our command centers, but NASA was next up in the supply delivery rotation. With all that was going on, critical supplies would probably run out before we could be retrieved, so rationing food would be important to allow for any delays. I pushed off from my seat and quickly grabbed Sergey's floating wrench. He didn't see it coming in time. Drops of blood pooled in the space above Sergey's limp body. The deep gash in his skull looked angry, but I had just followed orders. It wasn't personal. I retrieved some gauze from the first aid kit on the wall and covered Sergey's wounds. No sense in letting the blood roam free around the cabin. It'd just make a huge mess I'd have to clean up later. And the last thing I needed was a contaminated cabin breeding germs. I grabbed the space blanket from the kit and wrapped him up to keep his arms and legs from flailing about. It'd make it easier to drag him to the airlock. I had a gag reflex from the thought of sharing such a small space with a dead body. The acid burned the back of my throat. He needed to be gone. The space station clanged and shifted as if something had hit it. Meteors hitting the hull wasn't unheard of. We usually know ahead of time, but with what must be going on surface side, I could see it not getting onto the possible impact list. I pressed the button on the airlock, but it didn't open. I still had a hold of Sergey's feet, but the thought of touching a dead body creeped me out, so I dropped them. I'd been on this space station for a long time and knew that they wouldn't hit the floor with a thud, but still half expected them to in my mind. I repeatedly pressed the button and the airlock finally gave a hiss. I grabbed Sergey's feet again in anticipation of the door opening. As soon as it did, I'd toss him in as fast as possible and shut the door. Sergey was a good guy and didn't deserve this, but I had orders. I'd say a prayer for him before I flushed him into the vacuum of space. The computer counted down and the airlock door opened. 4 cosmonauts stood there with their hands in the air. Almost in unison, they raised their visors to assess the scene. When it sank in, one of them dropped a white flag that they had been holding. They stared at Sergey's lifeless body for a moment and then started towards me. My heart pounded in my chest, the adrenaline surging through my veins. I backed away, my eyes darting from one cosmonaut to the other. They looked grim, their faces set with determination, and I knew there was no point in trying to reason with them. They were here on a mission, just like I was. The first one reached for me, his gloved hand grabbing my arm. I yanked it back, the force causing me to spin slightly in the low gravity. I could feel my breath quickening, the panic building as I realized there was no easy way out of this. I needed to think, and fast. One of the cosmonauts spoke. "American, why did you do this? Why did you kill Sergey?" I swallowed, my throat dry. I knew there was no answer that would make them understand. I had followed my orders just as they had followed theirs. We were all pawns in a larger game, one where none of us had any real control. "It was orders," I stammered, trying to catch my breath. "They told me to secure the station. I had no choice." The cosmonaut's eyes narrowed, and he shook his head slowly. "Orders? We all have orders, but that does not mean we forget our humanity." Another cosmonaut stepped forward, his hand reaching out to steady me. He wasn't aggressive, but his grip was firm. I looked into his eyes, and there was something there, something like pity. "We came here to negotiate," he said softly. "We were hoping to find a way to coexist, despite what is happening on Earth. We thought that perhaps up here, in the vast emptiness of space, we could rise above the hatred and violence." My heart sank, a crushing weight settling in my chest. Negotiation, peace. All along that had been their goal, and I had destroyed it. I looked down at Sergey's wrapped body, his lifeless form floating gently beside me. He had been my friend, my partner, and now, because of me, he was gone. They weren't going to let me get away with this. 2 of the cosmonauts grabbed me, their hands like iron clamps on my arms. They pulled me towards the airlock. Panic surged through me, cold and consuming. I struggled, my feet kicking uselessly in the zero gravity, but they held firm. My pleas for mercy were swallowed by the cold, indifferent silence of the station. "No, please, you don't understand," I gasped, my voice cracking, desperate. "I was following orders. I didn't want to do it." They said nothing, their faces a mask of grim resolve. They knew what they had to do. I could see it in their eyes, a terrible acceptance. I was a threat, a loose end, something to be dealt with. The airlock loomed closer, its door wide open like the maw of some monstrous creature. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I could feel the sweat freezing on my skin. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out everything else. "Don't do this," I begged, my voice barely a whisper. "Please." They shoved me inside, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. The cold metal walls of the airlock surrounded me, their surface covered in scratches and dents, ghosts of past missions, past lives. The door closed with a soft hiss, sealing me inside. I pounded on it, my fist striking the metal, but it was useless. The cosmonauts stared at me through the small window, their expressions unreadable. One of them reached for the button. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt the tears welling up, blurring my vision. I thought of Sergey, of all the times we'd laughed, played chess, shared stories of home. I thought of my family back on Earth, faces that I would never see again. The countdown began, the robotic voice echoing inside the cramped space. 10, 9, 8. I pressed myself against the door, my chest heaving, my hands trembling. "Please, I don't want to die, not like this." I could see them turning away, their backs to me, already moving on. To them, I was already gone, a ghost in the void of space. 4, 3, 2, 1. The final number echoed in my ears, and I closed my eyes, my body trembling. I felt the pressure shift, the air being sucked out, the void reaching for me with icy fingers. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the endless expanse of stars, cold, indifferent, eternal. And then there was nothing. The silence of the void embraced me, and I was gone.